All right, everybody. How's it going? I hope everyone's doing well. I'm glad to be back on the stream this week. I had a very busy week because this was the week that I opened enrollment for my latest kind of serious attempt at doing a proper online course. This one with Nina Power, the British philosopher and a friend of mine. And the course is on the French philosopher Georges Bataille. We've been preparing this for a very long time, and I've been very excited to launch it. And finally, just this Wednesday, we opened enrollment, and it was awesome. We have almost 50 people enrolled at this point. And, not to brag or anything, but frankly, I actually really think this is a bit of a milestone in the contemporary history of intellectual life in some way, because, I'll do a kind of financial report later and show you all the results, but basically the interest in it has been great. And I think with 50 people enrolled, both in terms of the number of people participating, just and the sheer amount of kind of cultural energy in this course, and in terms of gross revenue, this is a real milestone, because basically Nina and I are both now individually, from this one course we're doing, we are making more than the average adjunct professor would make from a whole course. And that's a real turning point. I don't think anyone else has ever been able to pull this off at this scale. Obviously, there are lots of people doing different types of online courses, and they are often making huge sums of money. But there's no, PhD serious academic researchers who are doing genuinely disinterested, kind of truth for truth's sake, intellectual online courses, and having this level of success. As far as I know, I haven't met anyone who's doing that. So, I think for young people who are aspiring to pursue an intellectual life, the options that are now presented are it's a much wider palette of options than it used to be. And I think, frankly, people like myself are proving that you actually have better prospects going outside of the system. If your goal is to do a kind of long-term intellectual life and you want to do research and teaching as your main act in life, as your main vocation, it's increasingly looking like doing an independent kind of internet project is probably going to give you a higher expected value in the long run, if you average out the probabilities of success and the actual earning power of doing various intellectual projects. I think what I'm proving is that you can actually do quite well for yourself if you just go fully independent and you don't compromise, and you just do exactly what you want to do, and you build your own systems. So yeah, I believe that this recent course I'm doing with Nina, the results have been good enough so far that I actually am willing to go out on a limb and say that I think within a few years, people will point back to this online course I'm doing with Nina as a kind of turning point, as a real pivotal moment, because frankly, we're just proving that it can be done. No one's ever really proven that this can be done at this scale. And I think there are going to be a lot of adjunct professors, a lot of marginal academics, and also a lot of grad students right now who are trying to pursue academic careers within the academic system. And they're going to be looking at us and they're going to be like, holy shit, if that's possible, I'm going to try that instead. Because the academic grind is just increasingly shitty for pretty much everyone involved for the most part. Anyway, that's what I've been up to this week. That's just a little update on my projects. But I'm back here tonight on the live stream, on the live podcast, the Other Life podcast. Probably, I think, arguably the best podcast on the internet if you're interested in, the stuff I'm interested in. I guess that's kind of tautological, but be that as it may, our guest is actually waiting in the wings, so I don't want to keep him waiting too long. He showed up very promptly on time. We're going to be talking with an interesting man named Travis Corcoran. I think he has quite a nice little following on Twitter and elsewhere. So some of you probably already know about Travis. I'm sure many of you don't. And just to give him a little bit of a introduction before I bring him into the stream, he recently came on my radar through my friend Jeremy, who is the founder of this decentralized YouTube alternative called Library. And I'm pretty sure if I recall correctly, Jeremy was the one who said, "Hey, Justin, you should talk with Travis," also known on Twitter as Morlock P. And the one thing that jumped out at me that made me want to talk with him straight away was that he recently launched a Kickstarter for one of his book projects that he's launching. And this Kickstarter just absolutely crushed it. I think he asked for, something in the low thousands, a few $1,000s, and ended up he's already at like 55,000, something like that. And it's still increasing with many days left. So as those of you who've been following my podcast for a while know, one of the common themes I'm very interested in, and I talk a lot about, is just different experiments on the kind of independent intellectual and publishing fronts. This is a common recurring theme of the people I talk with and the ideas that I explore personally, just these new economies that are emerging for creative, independent intellectuals or creators to basically break all of the rules and do whatever they want in their own way, and oftentimes be more successful than they would have otherwise. So this has become a focus of the podcast and the Other Life project. And so once I saw this, I was like, oh, I got to talk to this guy. And then I learned he's also, I believe, he's been active in the Urbit community, which is also something a lot of people in my audience are interested in. And finally, I didn't even know this until after the fact, after we booked the live stream, but I was kind of doing some research on him. And Travis has also, I guess, been notorious at different moments for saying rather provocative things. We can get into it a little bit if we want to, but the purpose of this this particular talk is actually because I'm more interested in the book launch, the Kickstarter that he's done very successfully. I want to learn, kind of the story behind that, how he did that, and a little bit of the backstory and context for that. But also an interesting topic is the book that he is launching on Kickstarter. It's all about how to go from being a kind of urban city dweller to doing the whole homestead thing. And I'm very interested in his take on this because he's done this himself. He lives roughly in the New Hampshire area on a homestead. And he went from a kind of typical urban software engineering type of person to a rural New Hampshire homesteader. And now he's he is writing a book about this, and that was the book that he launched on the Kickstarter. So basically, many themes that we actually address frequently on this podcast. The independent publishing aspect, something we talk about a lot on this podcast. I know a lot of people who work in tech and are trying to kind of find some sort of alternative lifestyle that often has in their own mind some sort of aspect to it that involves a different type of arrangement, often outside of the city. So that, I think, is going to be very interesting to a lot of people who listen to this podcast or watch this podcast on YouTube. So the whole kind of alternative lifestyle design, and especially the kind of anti-urban kind of perspective. I know a lot of you out there are very interested in that. We're going to be covering that. And also, I didn't even know this, but apparently the kind of radical free speech dimension might also come into play here, because the way that I read Travis, and we'll get to learn much more about how he sees things in just a minute, but looking over his kind of whole life story and all the things he's done, these different themes are not random themes. So I think they're actually quite intertwined, because if you are the type of person that has a penchant for saying whatever you really think, even if it sounds fucking crazy or terrible or completely unacceptable to other people, if that's just the type of person you are, then I think you learn early in life to start making preparations and to start making strategies for how you're going to be able to, sustain your life and be independent, because you can kind of always feel that your institutional life is always vulnerable. And so, I think that we'll have so much to talk about with Travis on all of these fronts, which I think many of you are very interested in. So I think without further ado, I think that's enough of an introduction. Travis has been waiting in the wings very patiently for 7 minutes now. Sorry, I spoke a little too long. Let's bring Travis in, and this should be fun. All right, Travis, you are now on the stream. Can you hear me?
Okay. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. It looks like there's a little bit of a lag, but it's all good.
Cool.
This will go to the podcast later, so they won't know if the video and the audio are a little off. How are you doing today, Travis?
I'm doing great. And how are you?
I'm good. I can't complain. So first of all, I want to say huge congratulations on your amazingly successful Kickstarter campaign.
Thank you.
By the way, folks, for people listening, There is a link in the description below for anyone who wants to go check that out. Travis, you absolutely crushed it. My first question for you is just, were you expecting to have that amount of success, or was that truly a surprise to you?
Can I say both? So on the one hand, my first Kickstarter for some novels that I wrote a couple of years ago did $18,000, and I was very happy with that. And if you look at the statistics for Kickstarter publishing projects, to successfully hit your target and then hit the financial level, that was sort of in the top 3% or so. So I was very happy with that. And when this one came along, certainly bare minimum, I wanted to hit the exact same thing. And then in the back of my head, I accelerated this project. The book is 90% written, but I assumed, I'd do a couple of revisions and I'd, at my own good time, get it out in 3 or 4 years. And then given the absolute insanity of 2020 with, pandemic and riots and successor ideology and the stock market, down and then up and then, God knows where tomorrow, I realized, strike while the iron is hot. And so I, rushed and got the Kickstarter live in about 2 or 3 weeks. And Bern Hobart, who a lot of your audience probably overlaps with, had a tweet a day or so ago talking about, you'll sometimes set these goals for yourself and then, exceed your goals. And the trick is to immediately update your priors and, take that as your base case. So when the Kickstarter launched, my goal was 18K. And in the back of my mind, I had, something like 3 times that. If I hit 46, that was just a number that popped up. That would be success. And then I hit 46 and I looked at the number, it's only 50K. Geez, this is failing again. Yet another project not going where it should go. But anyway, if I pull back from that sort of melancholic Irish attitude towards things, yes, it's a great number and I'm very happy with it.
Right on. Do you think that there are any particular things you did in the launch strategy that were particularly effective and clever that you want to share with us?
Sure. So one thing is, back before I moved to the homestead about 7 years ago, I ran some small tech startups on my own. And I'm, a classic engineer, not a salesperson. So I had to force myself during those 14 years to read lots of sales and marketing books. And I never approached it with any enthusiasm. I approached it with reluctance. But despite that, I managed to learn a few things. And one of the things, the classic thing of sell the sizzle, not the steak. And the first time I heard that phrase, I thought that's terrible. It's deceptive. You're trying to sell me on, something other than the true product. But what I think that really gets to is sort of product audience or product market fit. What is it that people are really interested in? And if I'm selling a shovel, very few people are interested in a shovel. They're interested in planting an orchard or putting in a pond for their kids to play in, or something like that. So with the Kickstarter, I tried to, there's 1,000 ways I could have focused this. I could have talked about prepping. I could have talked about farming. I could have talked about, an ideological approach. But looking at sort of the events of the day, I thought, the basket of attributes that I want to talk about is establishing a life that feels more authentic and is a little bit distant from the insanity and the high variance that we're seeing in the cities. So I think that marketing technique worked. And I think that a pretty good Kickstarter video, which was done by my brother, who is a whiz at that, worked. And so, yeah,
right.
That's a lot of it.
Yeah. And I guess you already had something of an audience before then, because I know that you've been publishing fiction books primarily for some time. Mm-hmm. And you've been active on the internet, publishing your own work. How do you give us a sense of what does your kind of personal platform look like before this launch? Like what kind of systems do you have to kind of manage and build your audience?
That's a fine question. And writing is sort of, I don't even want to call it a secondary career because that implies it's a career. It's sort of a hobby and it's on my bucket list. So there are people who approach this a lot more seriously than I do. And they've got the complete list. They've got, their Patreon, they've got their Medium essays and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And that's wonderful. And kudos to those people who are really crushing it with the sort of complete panoply of tools. And I think you're certainly in that set. my audience has been organic. You started out saying you've been on the internet. And I'm like, oh, I've been on the internet since, 1989 or so, and going way back to the cypherpunks mailing list in the early 90s. I had a blog that was a little bit popular in the early days of blogs. It was sort of Instapundit adjacent. And I've got an acquaintance online. He's an adult. He's an engineer. He owns a house. And he mentioned passing, oh, yeah, a lot of my politics came from middle school when I was reading your blog. And my God, that'll make you feel old. So I would say that my audience is not sort of professionally managed by me for the purposes of, a platform and a brand. It's sort of incidentally done. And the blog I shut down around 2011, and you hinted in the prequel as to the events about that. And perhaps we'll talk about that later. We'll see. So since I stopped blogging, Twitter has mostly been my outlet for getting myself in trouble and or amassing an audience.
Right on. Okay. So other than Twitter, you don't do any particular operations to kind of grow or maintain or nurture an audience?
I've got a website, morlockpublishing.com, which I should spend some time on. I think I put a post up there every 6 months or so. But no, my audience, such as it is just Twitter. And I've got something like 9,000 followers now. So that's not bad for sort of accidental, crap posting and getting people to follow me.
Well, this will probably be delightful for people who are maybe thinking about trying to launch something on Kickstarter, but maybe fear that they need to have some kind of big platform and system built up to be able to do that successfully. It sounds like in your case, when you launched the Kickstarter, all you really did was share to Twitter and tell friends and people interested, and that was all it took for.
That's all I took.
Yeah. So do you have any read on kind of did it have some kind of viral dynamics? Did you have any read on how the Kickstarter trickled through different communities? Where did it get the most traction and how and why?
I'd love to have a really meaty, satisfying answer. Like, the trick is to post in this Facebook group, and from there it goes there. The actual answer is that I had a audience of longstanding, some people going back 10, 15, 20 years, and a pretty highly engaged core group. And then having had the first Kickstarter and having these books that are now live on Amazon and have been live for several years. And in the, aftermatter there, it says, for more updates, follow my blog, follow my Twitter account. And so I think that grew my Twitter account to a decent degree. And there was the essay 10 years or so ago talking about true fans. And if you've got 100 people or 1,000 people who are willing to do a certain amount. And I think that's some of what I've got going for me, that, I've got that base of true fans. And then hopping back to marketing for a minute, there's the concept of framing. And so if I'm trying to sell you a house, and you tell me that your price bracket is 300,000, but as a realtor, I think, actually, I bet 390 might work for you. I bet you could get approved. I will probably, first show you a couple of mobile homes that are overpriced. Then I will take you after that to, a house that's 395 or 410 and let you, without me saying anything, let you say, oh gosh, these are my choices. Stretch a little bit or get in something I really don't want. And after having shown you the 395 or 430, suddenly the 380 that I'm trying to sell you looks pretty reasonable. It's cheaper than the high end. So one important lesson in marketing is to frame things. And you can often create products that you don't even expect anyone to purchase. They exist just to be expensive and just to look a little bit outrageous. And on my first Kickstarter, I did something. I had hardcovers for $100. This is a pair of hardcovers because there were 2 novels. I had limited edition hardcovers, which are to some degree a manufactured scarcity, where I declare that I will only have 10 of these. They'll have a slightly different cover, and I'll sign them and number them. And that was 250. And then I wanted to make, 250 is a lot of money. And thank you very much to anyone who gave me $250. But I want people to be able to defend that price point to themselves. So I create, something higher yet, the extreme limited edition $1,000 edition. And I'm not going to sell any of these. And it's limited to only 3. And then suddenly 250 looks plausible. And so that edition of 10 sold out. And I actually ended up selling one of the $1,000 things. So I repeated these price points in this Kickstarter. And the $3,000 edition sold out in the first 60 seconds, as did the 10 $250 editions. So I guess anyone who's interested in this and thinking about their own brand part of the answer is, every overnight success is actually, the tail end of hard work. So what you're looking at in my Kickstarter that's doing well is thousands of people who've been slowly following me for literally 10 or 15 or 20 years. So, get started generating content and being interesting and delivering value to people. And the other part is, read marketing books. And marketing isn't about lying to your audience. It isn't about selling fluff. It's about sort of seeing what they really want and taking what you're capable of delivering and orienting it a bit, and in your particular case, Justin, with your skills, there's a lot of stuff you could do. You could, write a book, you could teach your courses, you could decide that you're going to try to write essays and submit them to national magazines. And to choose one, the courses that you're doing, that's not being false. That's just saying, hey, with the skill set I have, how can I deliver value to my audience? And so that's an important thing to think about. I think engineers all too often, and looking back at some of my failed startups, I looked at what it was I wanted to do and then charged forward with that without thinking, perhaps by steering the ship 5 degrees to the right, I can actually hit the port instead of hitting the rocks. And that's still true to myself as sailing a ship and going in this direction. So at this point, I forget what the original question was, so I've probably rambled a fair bit.
Yeah, no. That's all very good, though. And I think there are a lot of people in my audience who are engineers in one way or another, and they have that kind of background, they have that kind of career and that kind of mind. And yet, for many reasons, they are often quite unsatisfied with their jobs, whether that be in Silicon Valley or whatever, in part because of some of the kind of political environment at the moment, I think is very tense for a lot of people who want to think honestly and freely. And I've talked with a lot of people like that who are in one way or another kind of planning some sort of scheme where they cash out and they do something like, live on a farm or something like this, or some sort of other creative lifestyle design. So I would say, probably half of our conversation will be we'll talk about the homesteading stuff. I'd love to pick your brain about how people should do that and what you've learned, especially for a kind of people with this kind of engineering or professional background. But the other half that I think my audience will be equally interested in is to also learn a little bit about your publishing experiences. So you've been doing self-publishing for a while, is that right?
At this point, I've published 2 books. I published Powers of the Earth in 2018, and I presume I'm allowed to brag a bit. So that went on to win the Prometheus Award for Best Science Fiction Novel. And then I published the sequel a year later, and that won the Prometheus Award again. So I was very happy to be the first person to ever win 2 years back to back. And this pair of books, the first one is tentatively entitled Escape the City. And the second one is tentatively entitled A Human Being Should Be Able to Butcher a Hog, which is an excerpt from a Robert Heinlein quote. There's the trope, you can find it at TV Tropes or in Wikipedia, of the competent man. And reading Heinlein very early in life, I think I read his juvenile The Red Planet in first grade and then went on to read everything else by him. Heinlein has this quote of the competent man, and a lot of his fiction is a guy is dropped into a battle or a planet that's undeveloped, and he rises to the occasion and manages to do what needs to be done. And that was formative when I was young, and I've sort of very much oriented my life over the last I guess I'm turning 49 next week, so several decades. Sort of inspired by that Heinlein quote and inspired by the Foxfire books, which were sort of a artifact of the first Back to the Land movement back in the 70s. So, yeah. So this is, it's not that I've got a lot of self-publishing behind me, but I've got 2 books behind me, and now these next 2 coming out later this year.
Right. And you've done very well in the ways that you cited. And also I was going through your books and a lot of Amazon reviews, very positive reviews. So take us back to the beginning of that, when you first started to write and to publish from an independent publishing perspective. What did you learn early on in that experience that helped you be successful? Because a lot of people are listening to this and they're thinking, oh, I'd love to write my first, independently published science fiction book. But I have no idea how to even get my first 10 readers, let alone win an award. So any insights or tips there?
Gosh, there's a marketing guy who's written several books. It might be Seth Godin, it might not be. And his books were very frustrating for me back when I was trying to run my firm, because he was basically saying there are no tricks, just be insanely excellent at what you do. And one wants there to be a trick. And, I think, though, that I did take that approach with my novels because I had the leisure of working on them for as long as I wanted. I didn't need to pay the mortgage. I had a day job. So with my novels, I started on January 1st, 2011. And over the course of the year, I wrote the first draft. And then towards the end of the year, I read it and it was terrible. And so January 1st, 2012, I started over and rewrote them. And it was still terrible. And I did this about once a year. And I think that there were 6 or so complete drafts. And by the time it was done, it had grown from a 600-page single novel into about 1,300 pages spread across 2 novels. And, sort of my standard was these weren't just any novels. This was a particular story that I had wanted to tell with certain themes about politics and economics and sort of emergent phenomena and a whole bunch of other things. Had wanted to tell for 20 or 30 years. So to do an acceptable job and to cash in and get a check would be sort of degrading a particular opportunity. And so that's why I did an obsessive level of work on this. And there's a saying in author circles that you need to write 1 million words and throw them away. And now you've actually taught yourself the skill of writing. And I realized that by the time I had written this book 6 times over, I had, in fact, written 1 million words. And at that point, it was acceptably decent. I did the Kickstarter route with it. And I had also been amassing a list of people that I was hoping to get recommendations or blurbs or endorsements from, and sent it to a bunch of them. And I'll pause for a second and say that in the back of my mind, I had been aware of the Prometheus Award, which is an award for the best libertarian science fiction, and thought, gosh, it would be quite a coup to win that someday. And so I sort of set that as a goal, to make it so good that it met my standards and it met those standards. And I knew peripherally Eric S. Raymond from the open source area. And I think I'd known him a little bit back in the Usenet days in the 1990s. So tracked down his email and sent him a copy of the book, merely looking for a blurb. Now, it turned out that I didn't realize at the time that ESR was one of the judges of the Prometheus committee. So I sent it to Eric and he said, okay, I got it. I'll see if I have time. And a month went by and 2 went by and 3 went by. And at some point in there, I pinged him and he said, I haven't finished book 2 yet. So I got nervous and just kept going forward with final preparations for launch. And not too long before launch, he got back to me. And let's see, I'll actually, again, if you'll indulge me for a second.
Sure.
So my novels had been inspired by the Heinlein novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And I read this like an obsessive, like 30 times when I was a teen, maybe more. And Eric S. Raymond read the books and said, you've achieved something I've been hoping for decades someone would pull off. A book that is at once an affectionate tribute to and criticism response to The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. The Aristillus books are very strong. So your original question was sort of, how did I go and get good reviews and good awards and such? And I think the answer was, it was a thing that I cared about obsessively and insanely and to a irrational degree where the dollars per hour that I could ever conceivably get out would not make any sense.
Right.
And that level of emotional investment was the secret for me. I don't know if that's the secret for everyone, but
Yeah.
that's how I did it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm also hearing 2 things here, probably. One is, it might seem like nothing, but I think it is worth reflecting on. You started by saying that you had this goal of being able to produce something that reaches a certain objective standard as indexed by that award, the Prometheus Award. And so that's easy to kind of skip over, but I think it's actually worth pausing on, because to simply have something in your mind as an image of what you aspire to, that in itself is a little trick, because at least you have something to kind of pin your hopes to, something to kind of drive your ambitions, but also some kind of benchmark that you can compare yourself to, so that's one thing I would reflect on. That might've been, I mean, it's probably not coincidental that you started off with that as a goal, as a kind of structuring goal, and that ended up being the award that you won. So that's something I think people should note, perhaps. And the other thing is, it does seem like in your case, the success you had did have something to do with a little bit of social networking strategy, even if it wasn't super conscious on your part. The simple fact of, making a list of people you admire who kind of represent some type of gatekeeper or just a judge that you respect, someone whose opinion and judgment you respect, building that list. And also keeping that in mind as a goal of the people you're going to send this manuscript to. That again, shouldn't be totally glossed over. That's a bit of a tactic. That's a bit of a little thing that people might keep in mind. So that's all helpful, I think. Yeah,
I strongly agree.
Yeah, and okay, so you, as I understand it, you always have had software engineering as your vocation.
That's correct.
That's been how you pay the bills through most of your adult life. And so it was some time ago that you started doing the independent publishing. You had some success with that, but that's never been a moneymaker for you. That's a passion of yours that you're, invested in, but not really a moneymaker. And so at what point did you start thinking about leaving the city and doing a homesteading experiment?
Great question. So I was in Boy Scouts when I forget what the starting age is, 11, 12, 13. And being sort of a hyper INTJ, Spurg, stereotypical smart kid nerd. The first thing I did whenever I got interested in anything was, go to the library and read every single book in the small town library on the topic. So getting interested in camping, I went to the small town library and came across the sort of nature and recreation and outdoors section, and found something called Foxfire. So the interesting thing is, history is cyclical in a lot of ways. And this isn't just because there's some grand mystic helices, where things are always spiraling around. But there's a system with feedback loops. And, anyone near the neo-reactionary sector of Twitter has seen the sort of good times make soft men make hard times, et cetera. And that sort of thing operates in a bunch of ways. I think there are periods in life where people feel alienated both from the political structure and from the economic structure. And this is something the left used to talk about a lot, sort of the Marxist or Marxian alienation. And it's something that the fringe right is talking about a lot these days. And this isn't new. I think there was sort of World War II, where everyone came home, the horrors of war, and now they just wanted a staid, peaceful suburban existence. They got it. Their kids grew up in this, and it was boring as hell. And they wanted, rock concerts and LSD, and to go sailing or to build a log cabin. And so a lot of that is documented. And this was the Back to the Land movement. And the Back to the Land movement has had some echoes, sort of the permaculture, organic subculture has come out of that. And the Back to the Land movement has always been interesting because it hasn't been clearly one political side or the other. It's been a weird fusion where you'll have, sort of a left-wing commune just down the street from the, right-winger who goes out hunting. And you still see that today when you got to the country. It's often fairly red, but there'll be the old hippie couple with the Free Tibet sign, which I suppose is probably now more of a right-wing talking point in the 2020s. It was a left-wing talking point in the 1990s. And so anyway, we're looking at, early mid 1980s, and I'm at the public library and I'm reading the Foxfire books. And I thought, gosh, someday I want to build my own house. I want to, raise food, and I want to learn to blacksmith. And just as sort of an aside, at around the same time, my now wife, who was, 1,000 miles away, and she was in her public library looking at these, same books, and was thinking, someday I want to move to the country, marry a blacksmith, and, raise my own food. So unfortunately, we didn't meet each other when we were 21. It wasn't until our mid 30s. But not too long after she and I met, suddenly I've got another person pulling in the same direction, saying, hey, this isn't insane. Yes, a farm would be cool. And then you alluded, and I'll bring in another thread. You were talking about how I speak my mind. So yes, I've got a long history of speaking my mind. And in 2011, I said something somewhat spicy. And then I doubled down in 2013. In fact, it wasn't intended as that spicy. In 2013, there were some Danish artists who were celebrating George Orwell's 100th or 110th birthday. And they celebrated by going out and noticing that, hey, Orwell spoke about living in a surveillance culture, a surveillance society, and we live in one now. There are cameras everywhere. So they got a bunch of little party hats that you might give to kids at a 6th birthday party. And they put these party hats on security cameras all around the city court. happy birthday, George Orwell. So I saw this go by and I thought that this was pretty funny. And I tweeted about it. And I said, putting party cats on cameras, that's good. Shooting cameras, that's better. And shooting the people who are emplacing cameras, that's best. Unbeknownst to me, a mile or two from my house at that point, state police were installing security cameras because this was in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing. And I guess I was already a person of interest. So the state police said, on the one hand, we're installing cameras. And on the other hand, this known subversive is talking about how he's going to start shooting us any minute because we're emplacing cameras. And so anyway, that led to kinetic military action. But there was a knock on the door and a big legal situation after that.
Right. I believe if I read the story correctly, your whole house was basically searched and seized, and you had guns and stuff like that taken from you. Is that right?
That's correct. It was the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and as it turns out, we had in fact broken no laws. There was no illegal guns. There were no drugs. There was absolutely nothing. And I suppose that a more sober review showed that we were in the right. But, I'm going to hop sideways and talk about Black Lives Matter and the protests over police, problems. I'm sympathetic to that because, I long before the sort of carceral society or police overreach hit me personally, I'd been, very aware from reading, say Reason magazine going back to the 1990s about sort of the police overreach and this Praetorian culture of needing an enemy. This is something you see throughout history. The state security services always need to justify their existence, and they get into this sort of barracks siege mentality where, everyone out there is a scumbag and we need to, eradicate the villainy. So having been sort of anti-police corruption and anti-police brutality, I was already being paid attention to. So anyway, we've got the search of the house, and there's sort of no actual crimes, but the system didn't want to let it go that easily. So there was sort of a negotiated, okay, please don't trump up any crimes, and we of course will get out of your hair and get out of Dodge. That right. Helped crystallize the decision to move out of the city to the country.
Okay, and what state was that in when that happened?
That was Massachusetts.
That was Massachusetts. And I believe, if I recall correctly, the other comment that got you in really hot water was a similar point you were making, right? It's basically, if I understand you correctly, the points that have really gotten you in hot water is essentially that famous Jefferson quote about how, the tree of liberty needs to periodically be watered with the blood of tyrants, right?
Right.
So it's like, it's one of those ideas that many kind of good old-fashioned Americans will absolutely support and cheer on in theory, right? But then when it actually comes down to specific scenarios, and someone like you wants to come out and say, oh, okay, I believe the federal government has genuinely overstepped its constitutional boundaries, and therefore, according to this longstanding American wisdom that everyone respects, therefore, I hate to say it, but and so on and so on. You're of that belief, and you're willing to basically carry that logical conclusion to fruition, and to say it publicly in a way that many people just would never be comfortable saying that out loud.
Maybe a little less so now. There's been a lot of interesting discussion over the last couple of years about sort of esotericism in dangerous times. And, I'm becoming a bit of a believer in esotericism.
Interesting.
During the Cultural Revolution, is that the time when you want to, state something that should be non-controversial, but on the other hand, might get you beaten to death? Or do you want to be a little bit wiser and quieter?
Okay, that's interesting to note. So you've shifted your opinion a little bit on the tactics of kind of radical free speech absolutism.
Yeah. So given that you qualified that as the tactics, I would say, sort of the tactics for me, at least, I am less likely to poke the bear. I think that bear pokers serve a absolutely useful role in keeping the Overton window open. I think that we need bear pokers of all stripes. We don't merely want the Overton window to be over on my side of the political spectrum and 1 inch wide. We want the Overton window to be sort of very wide along multiple dimensions, X and Y and Z. But that having been said, I sort of, I've got a fair number of scars. Maybe I'll take it a little easy for a bit.
Well, it's kind of interesting that you made the connection to Black Lives Matter, and because in a weird way, there is this kind of convergence, or at least a possible convergence. I don't know if it's in any way materializing, but there is an interesting possible convergence between the kind of right libertarians and the anti-police left at the moment. And, what I'm actually thinking of in the moment is you've gotten in a lot of trouble for making very provocative comments about the justification for anti-government violence. And if you look at the discourses coming out right now, or even, think of the Black Panthers, right? Think of people like Huey Newton, who, frequently said, we're going to shoot back. We're going to shoot. We're going to shoot the cops. If the cops fuck with us anymore, we're going to shoot. We're going to shoot back. Said that straight up. You know what I mean? And that has a kind of absolutely acceptable, kind of fashionable, chic kind of quality to it. Whereas the more like right wing kind of libertarian attitudes, those are kind of seen as different in some way, but it's essentially the same. It's essentially the same position. And I wonder if the Black Lives Matter moment that we're in might actually be the basis for some sort of weird combination among the right wing libertarians and the kind of radical left anti-police folks.
I've got a few thoughts. One is, are you familiar with the concept of sort of Keegan levels of sort of morality?
I'm not sure I know what Keegan levels refers to.
There is a psychiatrist or psychologist, Keegan, and every psychologist worth his salt has to come up with his own framework for understanding things. So he did, and he posited sort of these different levels of morality. And there's 5 tiers, and at the absolute lowest tier, it's an infant, and an infant just wants what he wants immediately. The only morality is I'm hungry. And then as you go up a little bit, I think it's Keegan level 2 or 3. You get, my team wins. So if you talk to somebody who's, pro gay rights, and you say, okay, so on the one hand, we have to respect your gay rights, but conversely, shouldn't we also respect the right of, someone else to, run their own store or their own marriage or something in a way that's consistent with their, say, Catholic principles? And the answer would be no. See, the difference is that my gay rights are good and correct, but those principles are bad principles. And then if you go up one more level to Keegan level 4, you get sort of systemic neutrality or process neutrality, where the thought is, the way that we determine, say, the outcome of a trial is we have a process that is consistent and fair, and we have rules of evidence. And the point of the trial is not necessarily to have a philosopher king see the truth of the matter and pick the right output. The purpose of the trial is to do something that is consistent and reasonable and is a process, so that, occasionally we will let a guilty person go, and, unfortunately every now and then an innocent person will be convicted, but at least we know that everyone has a chance to rebut evidence that's brought before them, and we're never going to allow coerced confessions, even if a coerced confession might get us closer to justice, with a capital J. So anyway, I bring up Keegan levels just because I see a very distressing thing, which is, I think the current year politics are very Keegan level 3 or even 2, not Keegan level 4. So, a BLM or a left of center person might say, okay, so now we've got, blacks on the streets of America arming themselves. I bet no one in the NRA is in favor of this. I'm like, I've been posting to Usenet for, 25 or 30 years that I'm absolutely in favor of this, that, rights are rights for everybody, even if I disagree with their politics. Right. And I've been posting, for the same amount of time that police abuses are wrong, whether they're against a red tribe, patriot, or whether they're against a black person who, is an admitted criminal. I'm just trying to pick, someone who's so far outside of my tribe. They speak with an accent that's different from me. They live in an area that is antithetical to me. All these things, still due process is important. Rights are important. The rights of the accused. And so, a lot of time over the decades, or many times over the decades, I've tried to make common ground, saying, hey, if we agree with a set of principles, this will be good for everyone. And the answer is, yeah, but why would I agree with a Nazi? And so your question was,
Right.
is this a moment when left and right might have a fusion on some important topics? And my gosh, I'd love it if it were so, because, qualified immunity and police brutality and all of these things are important topics that should be important for both of the political tribes. And yet we had a really good discussion for about 12 hours after the George Floyd incident. And then it became about, pulling down statues and denouncing anyone who's, right of Mao as being a fascist collaborator. So unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic.
Right, right. So now you had said at the beginning of this conversation that when you decided to frame the Kickstarter project around the homesteading book that you're working on, you decided to not frame it in a prepper style. But as we talk about your other politics and your ideas and your life experiences on these fronts, I am kind of wondering if there is nonetheless does your interest in homesteading have a kind of prepper dimension to some degree?
That's a fine question. So first, let me say that I find myself somewhat post-ideological at this point, just because, the first time you try on an ideology, it fits you perfectly and you love it. And then eventually you find that it chafes you in one place. So you put on a different ideology and you experience that sort of rush of infatuation and first love all over again. But every time you rip off the Band-Aid, it gets a little easier to rip off Band-Aids and you become a little more critical of flaws. So
Well put.
I've tried on a few ideologies over 49 years, sort of basic bitch conservative when I was 9 years old and Reagan was president. And then I drifted through libertarianism into pure anarcho-capitalism. And I suppose at heart, I'm still a fair bit of a anarcho-capitalist. I would love a society where there was not initiation of force or violence against each other. And, the gun-toting MAGA heads could live on one side of the road and do whatever they want. And then across the street, the sort of lesbian witch commune could live over there and do whatever they want. And their disagreements would not be mediated through politics, but through sort of legal systems and the market. Like a lot of other disillusioned ANCAPs, I've realized that that's a great vision, but that is apparently not how our society as a whole is prepared to work. And so, I'm certainly curious, like everyone else, about, some of the aspects of neo-reaction, and I find that interesting to poke at. But I don't have any worldview that can crisply be labeled with one ideology.
Well, I guess what I would ask to follow up then is in your model of homesteading, because I looked through the book that you're launching on Kickstarter, and it's impressive. The table of contents is very varied and extensive, and it's more than 200 pages you're planning. So it's going to be a real tome. You clearly have a very thought through model of what it means to do homesteading and all of the considerations involved. So I'm guessing that with your politics and your background, there has to be some aspects in your mental model of homesteading that maybe, let's say, are geared towards the possibility of civil unrest, let's say. Are these things that you're thinking about? And if so, how?
Sure. That's a good question. And so I'll answer the second question second, but hopping back to the earliest one, which I didn't fully answer, I would say that, I think that politics is always to some degree embedded in praxis, merely by the choice of what you do or don't do, where you do it. So, it would be a rare person who was running a printing company that didn't have at some level a love of the printed word and of, using speech as a way to convince other people, et cetera. Now, we can imagine someone like that, in a left of center party or a right of center party. So there's a political aspect to it, but it's not necessarily a politics that is reductive or reducible to a single bit or a single Boolean. So when I was saying that I was post-ideological, I stand by that because there's not a single ideology, but, certainly I still have a worldview that's very important to me. So my approach to homesteading fits with my worldview, and there's a bunch of different aspects. One is sort of a Christian stewardship of the land. There's a lot of what I'm doing with the land, and it's hard, sweaty work, and I will probably not be the one to benefit for it. I'm wiping out invasive species, sort of weekend after weekend with a pick and a shovel. I'm pushing forests in a certain direction by selective pruning, et cetera. There's other stuff that I do that just sort of pushes towards a Heinleinian or a early American frontier ethos of self-reliance. And there was a big trend on Hacker News, news.ycombinator.com, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, where people were talking about their 100 things. And it was the sort of West Coast, Silicon Valley, San Francisco Buddhist minimalism that, is sort of the San Francisco spirituality. And simplicity and holiness was sort of expressed by how few material possessions you had. And this is an appealing aesthetic. But on the other hand, it's a little bit nonsense because, the person who prides himself that, he owns one fork and one knife really owns or has access to the means of production. He doesn't own a car, but he's got an account for Uber. So does that actually make your life simpler in a spiritual sense? Or is it just off book? Is your record keeping just sort of moving the capital somewhere else? So while I appreciate the aesthetics behind simplicity, or I forget the Greek philosopher who lived in a empty barrel or urn.
Diogenes. He's one of the patron saints of my podcast.
Awesome. In fact, I actually thought it was Diogenes, and I phrased it as I forget his name because I wasn't sure if I was going to mangle the pronunciation and didn't want to look like a fool. So I appreciate those aesthetics, but there's an aesthetic that I like more, which is the aesthetic of, again, the Heinleinian competent man. And I probably own more individual items than anyone listening to this podcast right now, just because I've got a workshop with metalworking equipment and woodworking equipment, and I've got a barn, and I've got spare parts for my tractor. And so one creates this infrastructure pyramid where, if you're in Silicon Valley and just own the fork, the next step up is you move to the suburbs and you own a roasting pan and, a food processor, et cetera. And then, the next step is you move to a farm, and because you raise your own pigs and make your own bacon, you have a deli slicer and an industrial meat grinder and a cutting board and a set of butcher's knives and a meat saw and on and on and on, plus the tools to maintain those. So, but circling back, your question was, does the lifestyle embed any sort of implicit philosophical or political stance? And yes, it does. It doesn't embody an anarcho-capitalist or a neo-reactionary stance. It embodies sort of a stance of self-sufficiency and competency and self-reliance. And I don't mean self-reliance merely at the object level of, well, obviously you rely on yourself. But I think that there's a very important cultural or spiritual outflow of that, which is when you start behaving that way, it alters your perceptions of things. And I think it alters them in a way that is conducive to make one a member of a well-functioning society. And just one more tangent, and then I'll stop babbling. Everyone in middle school learns about, and Thomas Jefferson got in this debate about the central bank, and he didn't like cities. He was in favor of the American yeoman farmer. And no one ever defines yeoman, and everyone glosses over it. And so it's presented as Thomas Jefferson was an agrarian, he liked farmers. And it was only about 3 or 4 years ago when I looked up the word yeoman. And it turns out that yeoman meant sort of self-employed or smallholder, as opposed to, as opposed to an employee of someone else's. And Justin, at this point, you're self-employed and you're doing your own thing. And so that is a form, and it's perhaps, 95% of the form of self-reliance that I'm talking about. You might not own a tractor, but you are putting your own food on your plate in a very real sense, just as real as if there were pigs involved. And that alters your entire outlook. You start to think much more about efficiency and what in hell am I actually trying to do, and who am I trying to deliver value to? And delivering value is a key thing. So I think that, Thomas Jefferson's point was American yeoman farmers, i.e. self-employed people. And I think one of the big changes in our country was not the Industrial Revolution as a first order effect, but as a second order effect. When people start working in factories, and there's economies of scales, it's an inevitable outflow, that their entire relationship to production and to self-reliance and to themselves as a first-class member of society changes.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothesis. And it's also interesting that we return again to Jefferson. That's, again, probably not accidental, right? That there is something kind of in equilibrium, I think, between this yeoman ideal and that kind of radical free speech attitude and the blood of tyrants side here, right? I mean, there's a connection there, right? And
Absolutely.
it stands to reason that if we had more people living on self-sufficient homesteads, we'd probably have a much more robust political culture where people spoke more freely, probably,
Mhm.
right? Because
Yep.
I think it's kind of easy and quite natural to see how those are linked, right? A lot of the people that are most kind of rabidly and demonically possessed by just the insane political fashions of the moment are often urban city dwellers who have some kind of institutionalized job where basically they're just highly dependent in many ways, both financially and socially, especially, and geographically. In many ways, they're just kind of they're locked in these like very, very dense webs of dependence. And there is a kind of interdependence that is healthy and good. In some ways, we do all rely on each other, and that's how a good community operates. But then there are these other kind of morbid and very, very undesirable forms of interdependence or codependence. And I think a lot of the kind of political morbidity that is going on in the cities is due to this weird kind of just lack of independence, both mental and spiritual and financial. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I'm just trying to draw these connections out for people. It's not for nothing that you, Travis, happen to be a kind of free speech firebrand who's gotten in hot water for saying what a lot of people would see as outrageous and dangerous things. And you're also killing it in self-publishing. And you're also on the forefront of figuring out how to do homesteads and now teaching other people to do that also. So, yeah, and the fact that we're kind of circling around Jefferson is that something also worth reflecting on, because what we're really facing here is that this is essentially a kind of aspect of American culture. This convergence of these themes is a very deeply American thing. And America's, I don't know, it's kind of unfashionable to be pro-America, and I'm not big on nationalism at all. I'm not big on like any of that stuff personally, but I do think America is pretty unique and pretty cool.
I agree with all of that, and I think you really, really put your finger on my thesis that I was trying to elucidate. So congratulations.
Nice.
You did a wonderful job of teasing the meat out when you were saying that this web of interdependence. I mean, people can be canceled when they're dependent. So you've got your inputs, and when someone else controls your inputs, you're effectively a slave. And then this ties over to sort of the Marxist idea of a wage slave. I've got a friend who's a Marxist. And I was at a corporate retreat with him once, and this is how we became friends. I thought, oh, the strange Marxist. And then it turns out that we'd read several books in common, and I knew a couple of Karl Marx quotes that I liked, and suddenly we're like, brother. But this also ties into the whole police abuses thing, that the police, individual police officers, are as embedded in a web of dependency as any SJW, because they're absolutely cancelable, in that they need the organization and the microculture around them for two different things. One is physical safety, and two is for their pensions. Personally, I think that if there a very minor reform that we could do is to make it illegal for police to have pensions and require that they have defined contribution retirement plans like 401ks. Because, the problem is, if you're an officer, if you try to speak up against corruption or speak up against the brass, you can get thrown out before your 20th year, and, they're holding the pension over your head.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I'm not sure that I've heard that, but that's an interesting possibility. Have you ever read the old internet classic, kind of in the niche we're roughly talking about, the Early Retirement Extreme? Do you know this book?
It sounds familiar. Is this some sort of disrupting retirement by doing it super fast and super early?
No, it's more. If I recall, I did read it a few years back when it was recommended to me, but it very much has this kind of ethos that you were describing of the complete man or the competent man. If I recall correctly, the thesis of that book, I forget the guy's name, but it is a pretty cool book, and the guy is he's preaching what he practices, so he's legit in that regard, if I recall correctly. But he goes for I think a much more minimalist kind of how to retire really early, and if I recall correctly, like very, very cheaply and minimalistically.
Right. So I know there's one guy, Mr. Mustard or something, who's on the internet, and he preaches.
I think the mustache guy.
That's probably it.
Yeah, that's a different model. Basically, there are all these different niches where people are basically trying to model how to do this type of thing in one way or another. These are all very different projects, but there's definitely a huge amount of interest and energy in, basically creative models that are reproducible for getting the fuck out of the like urban pathological rat race, basically.
Right.
So So let's talk a little bit more about your model then. So you decided to settle your homestead in New Hampshire. And I think this is an interesting discussion to be had, because right now I know for a fact there are a lot of people who maybe they make decent money doing, software engineering or whatever the case might be. Now, all of a sudden they're full-time remote. A bunch of the big tech companies just announced they're going full-time remote. So there are people currently living in expensive cities. They're not happy and they have a nice paycheck. It's going to stay consistent and they can work anywhere they want. So there is right now a kind of unspoken mad scramble for people to figure out where is the best place to go. And I know this in part because I recently published a blog post that actually, I think it got traction on Hacker News, and that's why it got a lot of traffic. And I got a lot of inbound from that blog post. And it was basically me laying out my own 2 cents on how I'm thinking about it at the moment, because I'm basically kind of in this camp, although I don't make terribly great money yet. I make enough that I could make moves, and we're planning to make some kind of move, but we don't know where yet. So I kind of just wrote out this blog post laying out how I think about it and some of my kind of creative, clever ideas for how maybe people could cooperate to do something cooperatively from out of the blue, from just internet relationships. And so this is a hot question. People are super interested in this. You obviously did a lot of research and you had to make this decision for yourself. It sounds like you decided that New Hampshire seems to be perhaps an optimal place. I'd love to hear the case for why people might consider moving to New Hampshire.
And I'll say it worked for me. There are other people who might find Tennessee or Texas or Alaska. So when my wife and I were trying to decide where we're going to relocate to, we knew that we wanted land, and not just 2 or 3 acres, but sort of bare minimum of 15 and 200 acres if we could find it. We wanted a sort of social environment that was compatible with the kind of liberty that we wanted. And so we made a list of, I think, Idaho, maybe Wyoming, Alaska, New Hampshire, and a few other places. And, we're both in our 40s, so that means that our parents are in their 70s. So we wanted places where we could, get to an airport and fly there in 1 hop or 2 hop, not necessarily 3 or 4. Wanted to be at a place where hospitals were within 30 or 45 minutes, not 2 or 3 hours. Wanted to be in a place where the weather was cooperative. I wouldn't consider myself a doomsday prepper or anything. But I suppose I do follow this sort of Gaussian model for the sort of bad things that are likely to happen in your life. So, if we just take a quick digression there, everyone listening to this is going to get laid off once or twice or 4 times over the career. So that's guaranteed. That's a once every 5 or 6 years kind of thing. There is going to be a recession every 8, 10 years. There's going to be a Great Depression every 60 or 70 or 80. The United States has a civil war, once every 150 years, 1776, 1861. You can do the math on that. We get in a world war every, 150 or 200 years. There's a plague every so often. So I do not see the Mad Max scenario where, the cities are nuked and the population is cut by 95%, et cetera, as very likely. It's not zero. It probably happens once every 1,000 years to a civilization. So before I jumped to what solution I wanted, I just sort of thought about threat models. And sorry, I'm coughing more and more because I'm talking so much. But I looked at threat models, and the absolute most important threat model is you're going to get laid off and there's going to be a recession. So the first thing to think about is finances. And so you don't want to extremely leverage yourself to get 500 acres plus a bunker plus this and that. You want to be anti-fragile and robust in a personal finance sense. And so anyway, just working through these threat models and a basic historic understanding of how often these things happen. And these happen in civilized countries, right? I mean, Europe itself suffered through World War II. And people in Russia suffered through the end of the Soviet Union when suddenly their pensions, were devalued, and you had to go out to your grandmother's dacha and grow potatoes there to get through the winter. So anyway, making this list and rank ordering the states, and then looking at the individual tax codes, because, the one thing that's going to hit for sure every single year is taxes at the state level. And New Hampshire has no income tax. So that worked well for us. And then finally putting that together with access to a major city, which is, something I don't need to get into too often. But you can imagine that if you're trying to do a startup and you need to meet with people, that they'll fly into Boston and you meet them at the airport. That's a possible scenario. So putting all of those things together, Southern New Hampshire made a lot of sense for us. It was either A or A- on every single criteria.
Interesting. That's cool. And did you consider the whole country, or were you constrained in any way?
We were constrained sort of culturally and by climate. Neither my wife nor I is a big fan of warm temperatures, so that's why we're looking at sort of the northern tier. I've got a lot of friends who are big fans of Tennessee and of Texas. I also didn't want to get too deep into red states. It's very easy to live in a blue state like I did in Massachusetts and be hyper aware of the limitations and the abuses of blue states. But I would caution anyone on either side of the political spectrum to don't think that your own side is incapable of excesses. It absolutely is.
Mm.
And so being in sort of a purplish state that was low taxes struck me as good. We're not going to get the insane over-the-top prosecutors that you sometimes see in Texas. We're not going to get the sort of insane over-the-top politically correct prosecutors that you might get in New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts.
Mm.
So I think there's a lot to be said for sort of dynamic stability as opposed to true stability.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. And New Hampshire and Vermont, they do have that weird kind of politics where there's actually there's a good amount of far right people and far left people. Is that right? So
yeah.
you suppose it has a kind of balancing effect.
That's my belief. That sort of each side has its own sort of Gaussian distribution, and to some degree they cancel each other out, or there's interference patterns or something. Pick whatever analogy you want.
Right. I know a lot of people who are trying to find some sort of exodus from California, whether it be the Bay Area or wherever. A lot of those people are naturally looking at places in the West.
Right.
I'm just kind of curious. And actually, I'm in Albuquerque at the moment, so my wife and I are currently considering places in the West, but mostly just out of geographical proximity at the moment. So we're going to check some places out. I was just curious if do you have a read on the West and kind of optimal choices or
that's
otherwise?
A fine question. We looked at that a little bit. We looked at Idaho. One thing I've seen as a dynamic in the West is that there are so many people fleeing California, and there is unfortunately this pattern where people are in California, they sort of vote for high taxes, high regulation, and they see that job growth gets a bit strangled. And then at least the stereotype goes, and I don't have hard data, so I don't want to say this is a fact, but the stereotype goes that these people relocate to adjoining states and then vote for the very same policies that they dislike the results of, perhaps being unclear on the connection between policy A and result B. So with that in mind, I personally wouldn't be as interested in sort of nearby obvious California exodus states, because I think that's where the rest of the California exodus is going.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. Are you observing in your areas? Is there an exodus from New York and Boston? And are you feeling that?
So, I've had a lot of people, sort of griefers, I guess, on Twitter say, oh, you're in New Hampshire. Ha, it's all going to be taken over by, Massachusetts high tax types, because, it voted for, such and such blue politician. And there's an actually interesting thing. If you look at the county by county returns in New Hampshire, the most consistently red counties and towns are the ones right along the Massachusetts border, because there's been this sort of osmotic diffusion or forced osmosis, where a certain demographic in Massachusetts that dislikes the ruling ideology there will relocate as close as they can while still across the border for lower taxes, et cetera. So the short answer is, I do not see New Hampshire swinging decisively blue, high tax, high regulation. I think it's going to continue a middle of the road approach. The country as a whole is an interesting question. The country as a whole has its center of gravity, and everyone gets dragged along with that. I do think that we're already in the last month or two or three starting to see an increase in urban exit. Once you've got two dogs, you can't go on petfinder.com anymore because you don't need any more pets. And once you're married, you can't go on the dating websites because that's not allowed. But if you like window shopping, what is it that you're allowed to click, once a week and then see what's new? And so I find myself on Zillow and realtor.com window shopping all the time. And I think that I have seen in the southern New Hampshire area a increase in prices and in sort of market speed. So it could be that I'm misperceiving it. It could be that it's a statistical anomaly, or it could be that we're already starting to see an exodus because of 2020 is so insane.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible, because I'm also looking at a lot of things right now pretty actively, looking at Zillow, looking at places like that. In fact, my wife's already started calling around, like kind of looking at leads on Craigslist or Zillow, because we're basically hitting the road like within a few weeks. Wonderful. And we don't have that much stuff. We're just putting it all in a car, and we're heading north from Albuquerque. just explore, meet some people from the internet,
Cool.
and but we are looking basically for somewhere to rent in the short term, but as an exploration or scouting mission for where we want to settle. And I don't have like a lifestyle model quite like fully developed or decided. But basically I'm just kind of scouting for like general areas that seem to be like a good place to invest in and potentially like build a family soon. And my folks are actually on the East Coast, so we could go anywhere. And, so I'm quite open to New Hampshire and places like that.
I hope you swing through New England, because I'll definitely have you over to the farm and give you a farm lunch. And
well, this is actually something I wanted to ask you about next. And by the way, I know we're going for about an hour. Do you have a little time for a few more? Okay, cool. So what is the scene like? What is your kind of lifestyle like on a daily basis? Because I think what a lot of people might be thinking is, oh gosh, if I left the city and I had some kind of homestead, I would just go mad from lack of social life, lack of events and cultural phenomena to kind of stay entertained and stimulated with. So I know from Jeremy, the founder of Library, he said he hangs out in the area, and apparently there's a bit of a kind of scene of interesting, weird schemers and kind of people looking for exit. So tell me about that. I would love to hear about that.
Sure. I live near Manchester, New Hampshire. And if you're from New York or LA, the idea that Manchester would bill itself a city is laughable. And yet it's a New Hampshire city. So it's got everything that normal cities have. It's got, restaurants and, microbrewers and coffee shops and bookstores. And when I go on meetup.com looking for stuff, there's always stuff going on, whether it's, meditation groups or politics or, tabletop wargaming, which is something I'd love to make some time for. So my own particular lifestyle is maybe not the absolute best example for someone who's asking, what's the cool stuff going on? Because, first of all, everyone when they're married slows down, and everyone when they're in their 40s slows down. And my wife and I both have tons of hands-on hobbies. And we've got all the space and all of the tools to do it. So, for a 20-something in the city, their idea of the perfect Saturday might be, wandering from this event to that event to the concert to et cetera.
Right.
And, my typical Saturday is, something like 8 hours of, fixing the tractor and installing fences.
And you like it?
I do like it. I really like it. And, one thing that I intend to write on the book is that, I've been sort of, in and out of the gym over my adult life. And I was last in the gym probably just before I moved to New Hampshire. And so, as a sort of OCD, borderline autistic engineer type, I've got logs. Everything's documented. It's like Lord Kelvin would approve. It has been reduced to numbers and measured. And I got back into the gym about 2 years ago. And after a month or two of it, I thought, I should see how far I've fallen from 7 years ago when I was a regular gym goer. And what I realized was that despite being away from the gym for 7 years, just doing work around the farm, all of my lifts were up, 10 or 20%. So I do enjoy living on a homestead because it is sort of physically gratifying. And this ties into this sort of alienation from the environment or alienation from labor. Mm-hmm. There is a complaint that you see all the time on Twitter, which is, oh God, I'm just in this cube. I'm typing XML or database lookups or whatever all day long for fun. I go home and I read esoteric blog posts by Slate Star Codex or Moldbug or something. And this is all wonderful. My mind is stimulated, but I'm an urban bug man. And, and I think that, we evolved in the natural world and our muscles evolved with the expectation that they would get used, 30 or 40 or 90 hours a week, and on and on and on. So there is sort of a deep physical satisfaction of just getting out and doing labor. So, it's Friday evening. So tomorrow I've got a list of things I'm going to be doing. And, one of them is weeding my corn patch. Another is digging up some invasive knotweed. And, I'm going to be welding up some shelves for my workshop. And it's fun stuff and I enjoy it.
All right. Wow. And so, yeah, you're at a point in your life where you don't really care much about, going into the city and doing cultural events. You like working hard with your family, and that's all you need for a happy life.
Yeah. If there were 26 hours in the day instead of 24, I'd probably, find a tabletop gaming group and, indulge in some of nerd hobbies. Right. And that stuff is around. I go on meetup.com and I see the stuff that I'm interested in doing, but then principle of revealed preference.
Now, are you familiar with, though? I'm just kind of curious. Are there other kind of interesting experiments and people like you and other types of people in the area And
Yeah.
is there a scene there? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
There
Or
is. So, I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a member of the Free State Project, but, I'm Free State Project adjacent. I know a bunch of people, and there are a lot of wacky, cool people. I know a sort of left libertarian who's building a hacker space, out in the boonies.
near Manchester?
Yeah, yeah.
That's cool.
It is. I've got other friends who are involved in HEMA, which is historical European martial arts. So they dress up in armor and swing swords, not padded swords, steel swords. They goddamn hit each other in the head with swords. I know a bunch of other homesteading types, and the homesteaders often, have get-togethers and potlucks. Actually, Jeremy Kaufman, who you mentioned, I've had the pleasure of having lunch with him a couple of times, and he's a fascinating guy, and I love his startup, Libri.io. I always mispronounce that, just like Diogenes. So,
how does he pronounce it?
How do I pronounce his startup?
How does he pronounce it? I thought it was just library.
I probably shouldn't have said anything.
I could be wrong though. What do I know?
We'll get Jeremy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, cool. So
anyway, there certainly is a. I don't know if you want to call it a scene or just sort of a resting vapor pressure of interesting weirdos around. To some degree, I try to create my own magic by, having gatherings at my farm, and I'll, invite my friends and get a good old crowd here. So, I would say to city people, it's probably less trivial to walk into an instant scene. I mean, if someone moves from New York City to Seattle, and whatever it is they're interested in, whether it's, micro brewing or punk rock or whatever, that scene is going on their first night there. They just need to find out where it is. And it takes a little more work in the boonies. Search costs are higher, as an economist might say.
Yeah, no, that's cool though. You're definitely putting Manchester on the map of possible options for me. I'm going to look into it for sure. Cool. Interesting. So I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I feel like maybe one or two more questions just on this front, because I think there's so many people interested in this right now. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, one question I kind of curious is if obviously your book is going to be pitched to a fairly broad audience, and as I said, it's got a massive table of contents. You're really aiming to do a comprehensive guide to moving from the city to homesteading. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious, maybe for people more like me specifically, in particular, engineers or scientists or my type of person who's kind of thinking about defecting from the city or institutions as a whole. I'm kind of curious, are there any particular, I don't know, bits of advice or tips or tricks or things to watch out for that you might send out specifically to other types of people who are kind of more analytical, engineering professional types of people? Like what is the engineering professional kind of most likely to not get right, or what's the most important for them to understand?
Right. Good question. I'll back up and say, I do sort of the most hardcore full-on version of homesteading. And I've got a friend who's very security conscious. So unfortunately, I can't even use his name lest I risk him yelling at me. But he's in exactly the same boat I am, sort of pure white collar, no history of this from the city. And, he raises cattle, and he has some, ultra heavy machinery, front end loaders and excavators and everything. I do similar things. I don't have the equipment, but I do my own butchering, and I slaughter my pigs and make my own bacon, et cetera. So if you look at us, we're, sort of the two with the knobs turned to 211. But there's a lot of other people, sort of from a similar scene and from a similar background or demographic who don't have the knob turned to 11. They turn it to 6 or 7, et cetera. So that's one thing I'm trying to be cognizant of in the book, that I don't want to make this so that is only if you're, going to go an insane off-grid prepping, raise all of your own food. You can turn the knob anywhere you want. And if you decide that you want a small garden, read halfway through the book. If you want a big garden, read through quarters of the way. And, if you don't want to butcher or slaughter a pig, you don't need to read those chapters. But the rest of it is relevant. And there's a lot of relevant small stuff. As a city dweller, you've got some sort of preconceptions. It's sort of, as Rumsfeld said, the unknown unknowns, and that you've probably never thought about, how does garbage collection work in the country? And the answer is there is no garbage truck. You either have a truck so that you can put your garbage in the back and bring it to the town dump, or you pay for a service to come and get it. And how does water work? How does internet work? And again, as a city dweller, you're not going to stop and think, before I move into this new apartment, can I get internet there? Whereas a country person, that's something you need to be aware of. So, I'd say that's probably where I bring the most value in what I'm trying to do. there's a woman on the internet, I forget her real name, but she goes by Literal Banana on Twitter. And she reposted a meme recently, which was sort of a curve of your knowledge. And at first, you know nothing about a problem domain, and then you know a bunch, and you realize what you know. And then eventually you sort of forget that your knowledge is anything interesting because it just seems like background information that everyone knows. And the perfect time to write down what you know is when the knowledge is there, but it's still fresh. And so that's what I'm striving to do in this. And I can already start to feel some of the stuff start to feel obvious. Like, well, everyone knows the kinds of 3-point hitches on a tractor. I don't need to cover that boring topic. So I don't know what the absolute specific gotchas would be for our demographic that would grab any person. But having been, having stepped in about 70 or 80 of these different bear traps myself, I know that there's a lot of them. And I'm trying to write the book while the sort of unknown unknowns are all fresh in my mind as dangers. But yeah, so some of those are right there. I would say just sort of thinking about utilities and giving an overview of how does one go about heating one's house? How does, one get garbage taken away? And there's also information about sort of getting along with neighbors. Not that I've done a perfect job on that, but I've tried really hard. And
why? How have you pissed off the neighbors?
I pissed off one neighbor by walking my own property. I was just walking along the property line, which is in dense forest, and he started yelling from his yard that I'd better not be on his land because he doesn't tolerate trespassers and blah, blah, blah. So we had a little interesting conversation, and I assured him that I was not on his land, and then paused and said, but by the way, I see this deer hunting stand here. Is this yours, the one on my land? And he said, well, that's been there for a while. So, and then there's more with that. His cow got loose and he penned it in one of my pastures.
And do you hunt for your food?
I have climbed up in a tree with a gun and I have seen deer, but I have never had both happen at the same time.
Are you planning to, or are you trying to?
I have. It hasn't been a priority the last couple of years just because there's so much other stuff. But I have my own tree stand and I've got my orange jacket. And at this point, having processed much larger animals like cows and pigs, a 100 or 150 pound deer would be quite tractable. So no, I mostly get my meat from animals that I raise, but I am interested in hunting and I hope to have success in the future.
Oh, cool. Okay. Now, I mean, I'm sure for a brainy professional coming from the city, there are going to be a bunch of things you don't expect and you don't know, and it kind of bites you in the ass and you figure out as you go. But on the other hand, I also have to imagine that if you're smart enough to do software engineering, you're probably going to be able to figure this out, right? Like, yeah.
I think I'm proof of that. I did figure it out. I grew up in the suburbs, and this was an adventure. And so a lot of people are somewhat disbelieving of that. I'll, post on Twitter pictures of, processing a 500-pound hog and making head cheese or something. And they'll say, where did you learn that? I'm like, books and trial and error. That's anyone could do this on their own with their own trial and error. And it wasn't Jefferson for once. It was Ben Franklin who had the quote, experience is a dear teacher, but only a fool learns it no other. So anyway, I was the fool, and now I'm selling a book so that you guys don't have to be.
Right on, right on. And I think probably the very final question would just be, we should talk a little bit about money and the finances that are required to kind of pull this off, right? Because
absolutely,
something we alluded to before is there are many people who have hacked this type of thing in different ways, right? There's different takes on this. You can do kind of high income, high wealth version of this. You can do this kind of bootstrapped and very, very cheap. There are different ways of thinking about it. So I'm curious, just from your perspective, for people who are listening to this, maybe they kind of identify with you or me, or in some ways their lives kind of sound like what we're talking about. But they're maybe wondering, okay, well, how much savings do I really need to pull this off?
Right.
How much monthly income do I really need to pull this off and to grow it? So I wonder could you give us a few pointers or heuristics?
And this is sort of an aspect of it that I'm most interested in. This is something I go into pretty good depth in the book on. And one sub aspect I go into is, hey, you're just out of college. You've got no resources. You're maybe not in a position to negotiate remote work. What is a 5-year or 10-year plan to get you ready for this when you're 28 or 32 or whatever? But as I go through each of the processes, I sort of talk, here's the low capital way to do it, the medium capital and the high capital. So in my particular case, we talked earlier about how I'm very politically outspoken and how that's had legal repercussions. And that was a 1-2 punch, because the crash of 2008 also torpedoed my startup. And I, stupidly tried to keep it alive for another 4 or 5 years, sort of laying off the staff and just doubling my hours. And so the way that ended up playing out was around the time of the whole sort of free speech issue. Was also forced to acknowledge, there's no money here. I'm paying myself sort of, minimum wage or less. Just shut it down. Time to declare bankruptcy. And so, I was coming from a pretty bad place financially speaking. When I moved to the homestead 7 years ago, I was, that was something like literally 30 days after declaring bankruptcy and having the bankruptcy finalized. It was having lawyer bills. It was having all of these things. But that having been said, because I had a trade I'd been pursuing for 20 years, I was pretty good at my job and could earn decent money. And I decided that, and this ties into the sort of power law distribution of prepping scenarios. We're probably not going to see a collapse of civilization. We're absolutely going to see other things, like recessions. And I realized, I have been in the survival situation of being deeply in debt and with not enough income. So my first priority is to work really, really hard and make sure that I'm never in that situation again. So for the first 4 or 5 years, I worked 2 jobs, sort of my Monday through Friday, and then also a weekend or after hours, 15 or 20 hours a week. And I did that so that I could, go from bankruptcy to having paid off my entire farm in a few years. And anyone in the demographic that, you're a member of and I'm a member of and that we're speaking here, this is something that you can do because real estate is a lot cheaper out in the country than it is in the city. And, you can get a pretty nice house for, $200,000 or something. And so, when people are coming out of college and going into Silicon Valley and making 160 their first year, or even if they're not so lucky as to be coders, they're something else, but, white collar and making decent money, you can have a pretty good quality of life because the baseline cost of living mortgage payment is so low. So that's, I'd say the very first thought of daydreaming about this is go on realtor.com, look at a map, pick some place that's, 45 miles outside of Manchester or outside of Spokane or out the boonies, and just look how cheap things are. And having done that, you could, then play with a spreadsheet and realize, gosh, maybe in 3 or 4 or 5 years, I could pay this off. And for quality of life, knowing that you are uncancelable, that you could, it doesn't matter what blog post they dig up or, something you posted over your 300 baud modem in 1986, that, you said that bad people are bad, even though that's controversial. So that would be my first thought of look for sort of minimum sustainable ways. I suppose I could talk about homemade bacon. I could talk about everyone else is in lockdown during the city and I get to go out and take a mile-long walk without leaving my property. That's all good. But one of the best things is just the knowledge that you don't owe a single penny to anyone else in the world. That's an amazing feeling. And that's achievable when you escape the city and move out to the country.
Right on. Right on. Well, very interesting talk. Thank you for sharing a lot of your knowledge and experience, both when it comes to the self-publishing hustle and also the homestead hustle. So yeah, you've done a lot of interesting things in your time, and thank you for sharing some of the lessons. And yeah, once again, big congratulations on the hugely successful Kickstarter campaign.
Thank you. Appreciate
Although
that.
For anyone out there listening to this or watching this, it is still open. So if you want to support Travis and what he's doing and get the book, you can do that. There's a link to the Kickstarter in the description or the show notes. And yeah, I just want to basically thank you for your time. Cool. You're a really interesting dude, Travis, and you're clearly a kind of ungovernably independent mind, and you do what you want and you figure it out, and I really appreciate that about people. And yeah, thanks for making some time to talk with me and my audience, and for sharing the wisdom you've collected along the way.
I can think of no higher compliment than calling me an ungovernable mind. Thank you very much, Justin. It was a pleasure.
Best of luck with everything, Travis. Stay in touch.
Night. Bye.
Later. All right, that was interesting. Yeah, that is an interesting dude. I hope you found that useful. I'm still thinking about some of it. It is just interesting to me how the whole kind of need to speak freely, no matter how much it upsets people, and even probably a little bit of that, a little bit of the taste for provocation just converges with this drive for financial independence and geographical and social independence. And, that's really interesting to think about. It's also interesting to think about how he's a Catholic man, and he's Irish too, as you could deduce. And so he and I are both Irish Catholic men who, have a predilection for, I guess, saying things that a lot of other people find outrageous. And but I appreciate it and admire his grit and his elbow grease and getting out there and just figuring it out. And that's cool. I appreciate that. So that was fun. Thanks for hanging out, everyone. My course on Bataille, which I just launched on Wednesday, which has been hugely successful, is still open. And if you want to get in on it, we have like 49 people that are enrolled in this course. So it's pretty massive. It's going to be pretty epic. We've only just opened it. And this is going to be, as I said at the beginning, I think people are going to look back on this course and they're going to be like, oh, that was a real turning point. That was the beginning of the end for academia. I really do think that this course might be the real kind of death knell in a way, in a modest way, but in a real way, just because we have almost 50 people enrolled already. And Nina Power is amazing. She's awesome. And it's going to be epic. It's going to be intense and amazing. And it's already having a major impact, at least in terms of the impact on the culture, or how should I put it? Doesn't have impact yet because we're not doing anything yet, but we only just opened it. But it's clearly about to make a splash. It's prepared to make a splash, and there's a lot of interest. So if you just look at it in terms of kind of the market power that it's proving, that it's demonstrating, it's a real new milestone in, I think, just the demonstration that there is this whole new economy possible. There's a whole new way to structure a independent intellectual life and do research and teaching, and to do those things in a way that is financially sustainable to the same level as an academic lifestyle. And I think that's the game changer. And you know what? I'm fucking proud of that. I really am fucking pretty proud of myself, because it's been 1 year since I left academia, and it's taken some time to build up my systems. But I've been doing it slowly but surely, and it's working. It's all working, just as I said it would. I'm not, super rich or anything by any means, but everything is growing, and I'm paying all the bills. And this course in particular feels particularly satisfying with the number of enrollments we have and just the gross revenue that we're bringing in from this course. I'll do a big kind of financial report later at some point and kind of show you all. I'll show you all the details. I'm not shy about numbers and stuff like that. But I'll do that report when it's all done. But basically, Nina and I are individually making it more than the average adjunct professor would make for a course. So if that's not a milestone in the distribution of power, how the distribution of intellectual and academic power is changing away from the universities towards independent internet projects, if that's not a demonstration, I don't know what is. I'm very proud of that. And you know what? I've been working super hard this week getting the course off the ground, and I'm actually pretty strung out from doing that. It's a very intense thing to do a whole launch, a big launch of something like an online course. Just requires a lot of little logistical things all the time. And I guess the truth is, on this Friday evening, I'm a little tired. I'm a little tense from launching the course. But with all the success that we've had, I'm just going to take a little moment to tell you how satisfied and proud I am, because I called it. I said I was going to do it. And a year later, I'm doing it. I mean, I've been doing it, but when you have a real milestone, there's nothing wrong with taking a minute to, pat yourself on the back a little bit. So that's what I'm doing. Anyway, if you're interested, you can still enroll. There's a link in the description below or the show notes, depending on how you're listening to this or watching this. So it'll be open for at least a few more days. The seminars start on July 11th, Saturday. All of them will be on Saturdays for 8 weeks in a row from July 11th. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I thought Travis was really interesting. He's very, he's a provocative dude. You should go and do a Google search for the things he's talked about, the things he said. It's like pretty provocative. I mean, if you think I'm provocative, some of the things he said on the theme that we were discussing, basically on the justifiability of anti-government violence. He has said some things in that regard, which, check it out. Look, I really genuinely think people should be able to say whatever they want, whether I like it or not. And, even if you disagree with someone, when you meet someone who is willing to say some pretty provocative stuff, you just I don't know. I feel like you got to respect that. That's how I feel about it. Especially if it's clear that he's an upright guy. He's obviously an upright guy. He doesn't want to do any harm to anyone. Like he's not actually causing any harm. He's not, building some kind of paramilitary force or something like this. He seems like an upright guy who's just basically has strong libertarian beliefs, and he has at a few different moments basically said what he really thought when it comes to what's justified. And I think you got to respect people who say what they really think. So anyway, that was cool. I thought he was interesting, and he was very generous with sharing practical insights that he could on these different themes that I think many people who listen to my podcast are interested in. So, all right. Thanks, everyone. I hope you found this fun. Hit me up on Twitter or shoot me an email, whatever. I'll see you soon. It's Friday night, and I've had a very, very long week, so I'm sort of burning out in the middle of this final sentence. All right, everyone. Have a lovely weekend. I'll see you soon. Subscribe to the Other Life podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Oh, and finally, big thank you to all of my patrons. You make this possible. You're the best. Very grateful. Bye, everybody.